A Letter Concerning Toleration by John Locke quotes, "A Letter Concerning Toleration by John Locke is a seminal work advocating for religious tolerance in a time when sectarian conflict and persecution were prevalent in Europe. Locke argues against the use of coercive power by the state to enforce religious uniformity, asserting that true faith cannot be compelled, and that civil authority should concern itself only with the preservation of order and property. He champions the separation between church and state, insisting that individuals must be free to pursue their own beliefs without fear of state interference. Locke's letter lays a philosophical foundation for the principles of liberty, equality, and respect for different religious practices, and remains influential in discussions about religious freedom and human rights. Quote 1. I esteem that toleration to be the chief characteristic mark of the true church. Locke argues that the true essence of the Christian church is not found in displays of grandeur or rigid orthodoxy, but in its practice of tolerance toward differing beliefs. He critiques religious groups that seek power and dominance over others through force, emphasizing that true Christianity is about love, charity, and meekness toward all people, including those of different faiths. Quote 2. Whosoever will list himself under the banner of Christ must, in the first place, and above all things, make war upon his own lusts and vices. Here, Locke stresses that a genuine Christian must prioritize inner moral transformation over external rituals. He points out that calling oneself a Christian is meaningless without the commitment to live a life of virtue and humility. External religious conformity, without personal moral reform, is insufficient in fulfilling the true obligations of Christianity. Quote 3. The toleration of those that differ from others in matters of religion is so agreeable to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the genuine reason of mankind that it seems monstrous for men to be so blind as not to perceive the necessity and advantage of it. Locke highlights the logical and moral alignment of religious tolerance with both the teachings of Christ and human reason. He expresses incredulity that people could fail to see the benefits of tolerance, arguing that religious persecution is not only unchristian, but also irrational. He suggests that the inability to accept differing religious views is driven by misguided ambition and pride. Quote 4. The care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate any more than to other men. Locke firmly separates the roles of government and religion, arguing that civil authorities have no mandate to govern the spiritual lives of individuals. He believes that the state's power should be limited to preserving civil interests such as life, liberty, and property, while the care of one's soul is a personal matter that cannot be forced by law or governmental authority. Quote 5. All the life and power of true religion consist in the inward and full persuasion of the mind, and faith is not faith without believing. Locke underscores the importance of sincere belief in religion, stating that true faith cannot be coerced or imposed externally. He argues that without genuine internal conviction, outward religious practices are hollow and cannot contribute to one's salvation. Locke emphasizes that belief must come from personal understanding and voluntary acceptance. Quote 6. For force belongs wholly to the civil magistrate, and the possession of all outward goods is subject to his jurisdiction. In this passage, Locke defines the limits of civil authority, arguing that it extends only to the governance of material and civil matters, such as property and social order. He asserts that spiritual matters, such as belief and worship, fall outside the scope of governmental control, emphasizing the need for a clear distinction between civil and religious spheres. Quote 7. I esteem it above all things necessary to distinguish exactly the business of civil government from that of religion, and to settle the just bounds that lie between the one and the other. Locke calls for a strict separation between civil authority and religious practice, arguing that only by clearly delineating their roles can we avoid conflict and persecution? He believes that confusion between civil and religious responsibilities leads to endless controversies and injustices, as neither should impose upon the other. Quote 8. Nobody is born a member of any church, otherwise the religion of parents would descend unto children by the same right of inheritance as their temporal estates. Locke argues that membership in a church must be a voluntary act rather than an inherited status. He draws an analogy to property, stating that just as wealth and estates are passed down through generations, religious belief should not be treated as something inherited by birth, but as a personal choice based on individual conviction. Quote 9. But that the Church of Christ should persecute others and force others by fire and sword to embrace her faith and doctrine, I could never yet find in any of the books of the New Testament. Locke firmly condemns religious persecution, pointing out that there is no justification for it in the teachings of Christ or the New Testament. He believes that using violence or coercion to enforce religious conformity is fundamentally unchristian, and that true followers of Christ must rely on persuasion and example rather than force. Quote 10. In teaching, instructing, and redressing the erroneous by reason, he may certainly do what becomes any good man to do. Magistracy does not oblige him to put off either humanity or Christianity. Locke suggests that civil authorities can and should use reason and persuasion to guide people toward truth, but they must do so in a humane and Christian manner. He argues that just because someone holds power does not mean they are free to abandon their moral responsibilities, emphasizing that even those in authority should act with kindness and charity. Quote 11. For churches have neither any jurisdiction in worldly matters, nor are fire and sword any proper instruments wherewith to convince men's minds of error and inform them of the truth. Locke makes it clear that religious institutions should not have authority over civil or worldly affairs. He emphasizes that force and violence, symbolized by fire and sword, are ineffective and inappropriate tools for converting individuals or convincing them of religious truth. Instead, religious differences should be addressed through persuasion and reason, not through coercion or violence. Quote 12. The civil power is the same in every place, nor can that power, in the hands of a Christian prince, confer any greater authority upon the church than in the hands of a heathen, which is to say, just none at all. Locke argues that civil authority, regardless of whether it is wielded by a Christian or a non-Christian, cannot bestow upon the church any power over spiritual matters. The power of civil government is limited to secular concerns, and it cannot be used to enforce religious orthodoxy or grant the church control over individual beliefs and practices. Quote 13. No peace and security, no, not so much as common friendship, can ever be established or preserved amongst men, so long as this opinion prevails, that dominion is founded in grace, and that religion is to be propagated by force of arms. Locke warns that the belief that religious authority justifies political dominion and the use of violence to spread faith will inevitably lead to discord, conflict, and endless wars. He asserts that peace and mutual understanding among people cannot be achieved if religion is spread through coercion and force, as this fosters hatred and division rather than unity. Quote 14. He that pretends to be a successor of the apostles and takes upon him the office of teaching is obliged also to admonish his hearers of the duties of peace and goodwill towards all men, as well towards the erroneous as the orthodox. Locke states that religious leaders who claim to follow in the footsteps of the apostles must preach the values of peace, tolerance, and goodwill, not only toward those who share their beliefs, but also toward those who hold different opinions. Religious leaders have a responsibility to encourage their followers to practice charity and patience, rather than fueling hostility and division. Quote 15. For if there were several ways that led thither, there would not be so much as a pretense left for compulsion. Locke uses this statement to criticize the notion of forced religious conformity. He suggests that if there were multiple paths to salvation, the justification for compelling others to follow a single religious path would be baseless. Locke questions the validity of compulsion in religious matters by highlighting the diversity of spiritual beliefs and the personal nature of one's journey to salvation. Quote 16. For whatsoever may be doubtful in religion, yet this at least is certain, that no religion which I believe not to be true can be either true or profitable unto me. Locke argues that an individual cannot derive spiritual benefit from a religion that they do not genuinely believe to be true. He insists that forced conformity to religious practices or beliefs without personal conviction is meaningless and ineffective in achieving salvation. Faith, according to Locke, must be sincere and come from an inner conviction rather than external pressures or obligations. Quote 17. All men know and acknowledge that God ought to be publicly worshipped. Why otherwise do they compel one another unto the public assemblies? Locke questions the inconsistency in the logic of religious coercion, pointing out that if all people agree that God should be worshipped publicly, there should be no need for force to compel attendance at religious services. He implies that true devotion and worship should come from voluntary participation, not from compulsion, and that genuine religious practice cannot be forced upon individuals. Quote 18. The public good is the rule and measure of all lawmaking. Locke affirms that the primary concern of any law or legislative action should be the public good. In matters of civil governance, laws must be created to benefit the community as a whole, not to enforce particular religious practices or beliefs. He emphasizes that civil laws should focus on promoting social order and well-being rather than imposing religious conformity. Quote 19. Things indifferent are not otherwise lawful in the worship of God than as they are instituted by God himself, and as he, by some positive command, has ordained them to be made a part of that worship, which he will vouchsafe to accept at the hands of poor, sinful men. Locke stresses that in matters of religious worship, only those practices specifically ordained by God can be considered acceptable. He argues that human authorities do not have the right to introduce or enforce rituals that are not explicitly commanded by God, as such practices could be offensive rather than pleasing to the divine. Religious worship, therefore, must adhere to God's will as revealed in sacred scripture. Quote 20. You will say, by this rule, if some congregations should have a mind to sacrifice infants, or, as the primitive Christians were falsely accused, lustfully pollute themselves in promiscuous uncleanness, or practice any other such heinous enormities, is the magistrate obliged to tolerate them, because they are committed in a religious assembly? I answer, no. Locke argues that while religious freedom should be protected, it does not extend to acts that are harmful or morally unacceptable, such as infanticide or gross immorality, even if done in the name of religion. He emphasizes that acts which are not lawful in everyday life cannot be justified merely by being part of religious practice. Therefore, the magistrate is not bound to tolerate actions that violate societal laws or harm others, even if they are carried out in the context of religious worship. Quote 21. Whatsoever is lawful in the commonwealth cannot be prohibited by the magistrate in the church. Locke points out that actions considered lawful in society should not be forbidden in religious settings. He advocates for the same freedoms within religious practices that are granted in secular life, as long as those practices do not harm the common good. This highlights his belief in a consistent application of law and freedom across both civil and religious domains, without allowing the state to interfere arbitrarily in religious matters. Quote 22. What power can be given to the magistrate for the suppression of an idolatrous church, which may not in time and place be made use of to the ruin of an orthodox one? Locke questions the wisdom of giving civil authorities the power to suppress religious practices like idolatry, suggesting that such power could be misused to persecute any religion, including the Orthodox. He warns that allowing magistrates to impose their own religious views can lead to the oppression of any minority belief, reinforcing the need for religious tolerance to avoid the dangers of arbitrary power. Quote 23. If they are persuaded that they please God in observing the rites of their own country, and that they shall obtain happiness by that means, they are to be left unto God and themselves. Locke insists that people should be free to follow their own religious beliefs and practices without interference, as long as they believe they are acting in accordance with God's will. He emphasizes that matters of faith and worship should be left to individual conscience and divine judgment, rather than being controlled or punished by the state. This underscores his advocacy for the separation of church and state, and the importance of religious liberty. Quote 24. For it does not belong unto the magistrate to make use of his sword in punishing everything, indifferently, that he takes to be a sin against God. Locke argues that it is not the role of the government to punish all sins or offenses against religious teachings. He distinguishes between sins that harm others or disturb public peace, and those that are private matters of faith, stating that the state should only intervene when civil rights or public order are threatened, not simply because something is deemed sinful according to religious doctrine. Quote 25. There is absolutely no such thing under the gospel as a Christian commonwealth. Locke asserts that the gospel does not prescribe any specific form of government or political structure. He argues that while many cities and kingdoms have embraced Christianity, they have retained their own political systems, which remain separate from religious laws. The gospel, according to Locke, teaches individuals how to achieve eternal life through faith and good works, but it does not mandate a theocratic system or give any government the authority to enforce religious conformity. Quote 26. The power of the magistrate and the estates of the people may be equally secure, whether any man believe these things or no. Locke emphasizes that civil society and governmental authority are not threatened by individual religious beliefs or unbeliefs. Whether someone believes in certain religious doctrines or not does not affect the safety or stability of the state. Locke argues that the role of government is to maintain public order and protect property, not to enforce religious orthodoxy, further promoting the idea of religious tolerance. Quote 27. Truth certainly would do well enough if she were once left to shift for herself. Locke expresses confidence in the strength of truth, arguing that it does not need the support of governmental power to prevail. He suggests that truth can stand on its own and does not require force or coercion to be accepted. Locke contrasts truth with falsehood, which often needs external support to survive, reinforcing his belief that the state should not interfere in matters of belief or impose religious conformity through law. Quote 28. Errors, indeed, prevail by the assistance of foreign and borrowed succors. Locke suggests that errors, or false beliefs, often spread through the use of external force or coercion. He contrasts this with the power of truth, which he believes can succeed without such help. This statement reinforces his argument against using political power to enforce religious doctrines, as it often only aids the spread of falsehoods rather than allowing truth to emerge naturally through reason and persuasion. Quote 29. Lastly, those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. Locke argues that atheists cannot be tolerated in society because they lack the belief in God, which he sees as the foundation of trust and moral obligation in society. Without belief in a higher power, Locke believes atheists have no ultimate accountability for keeping promises or abiding by oaths, which undermines the stability of human relationships and societal bonds. Quote 30. These accusations would soon cease if the law of toleration were once so settled that all churches were obliged to lay down toleration as the foundation of their own liberty, and teach that liberty of conscience is every man's natural right, equally belonging to dissenters as to themselves. Locke suggests that religious conflicts and accusations of sedition would dissipate if all churches embraced the principle of religious tolerance. He argues that if every religious group recognized freedom of conscience as a fundamental right, extended equally to all, including dissenters, it would create a more peaceful and stable society where religious persecution and disputes would be minimized. Quote 31, "Just and moderate governments are everywhere quiet, everywhere safe, but oppression raises ferments and makes men struggle to cast off an uneasy and tyrannical yoke." Locke asserts that fair and just governments tend to enjoy peace and security, while oppressive regimes provoke unrest and resistance. When people are subjected to tyranny or denied their rights, they naturally seek to overthrow their oppressors. He highlights that it is not religion itself that causes turmoil, but the persecution and oppression associated with the denial of religious freedom. Quote 32, "The heads and leaders of the Church, moved by avarice and insatiable desire of dominion, making use of the immoderate ambition of magistrates and the credulous superstition of the giddy multitude, have incensed and animated them against those that dissent from themselves." Locke criticizes religious leaders who manipulate political rulers and the masses to persecute dissenters for their own gain. He suggests that these leaders are driven by greed and a lust for power, using religious authority to stir up conflicts and oppress those who do not conform to their beliefs, further fueling religious and political discord. Quote 33, "We must, therefore, seek another cause of those evils that are charged upon religion, and, if we consider right, we shall find it to consist wholly in the subject that I am treating of. It is not the diversity of opinions, which cannot be avoided, but the refusal of toleration to those that are of different opinions, which might have been granted, that has produced all the bustles and wars that have been in the Christian world upon account of religion." Locke argues that the real cause of religious conflict is not the diversity of religious beliefs, which is natural and inevitable, but the refusal to tolerate differing opinions. He points out that if tolerance had been practiced, much of the religious violence and wars in Christian history could have been avoided. The failure to allow religious freedom is the true source of turmoil, not the mere existence of differing doctrines. Quote 34, "Thus much concerning heresy, which word in common use is applied only to the doctrinal part of religion. Let us now consider schism, which is a crime near akin to it, for both these words seem unto me to signify an ill-grounded separation in ecclesiastical communion, made about things not necessary." Locke distinguishes between heresy and schism, defining heresy as related to doctrinal disagreements and schism as a separation in religious practice or discipline over non-essential matters. He critiques both as unnecessary divisions within religious communities, particularly when they are based on issues not clearly mandated by Scripture, emphasizing the importance of unity in faith and worship. Quote 35, "Schism, then, for the same reasons that have already been alleged, is nothing else but a separation made in the communion of the Church, upon account of something in divine worship or ecclesiastical discipline that is not any necessary part of it." Locke explains that schism arises when a group breaks away from a church over issues of worship or discipline that are not fundamental to the faith. He argues that such separations are not justified because they concern matters that are not essential to Christian belief, and therefore should not divide believers or lead to the formation of new sects. A Letter Concerning Toleration by John Locke concludes with a powerful reaffirmation of the need for tolerance and religious freedom. Locke warns against the dangers of intertwining state power with religious authority, emphasizing that such alliances often lead to corruption and persecution rather than genuine piety. He advocates for a society where diverse beliefs can coexist peacefully, without interference from the government or one another. Locke's insistence on separating civil and ecclesiastical authority has become a cornerstone of liberal democratic thought, underlining the idea that a just society must prioritize individual freedom of conscience over enforced religious conformity.
Curious to dive into the mind of John Locke? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of A Letter Concerning Toleration in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.